I think that all the experiments are three-dimensional experiments. You use a tank. Do you believe that there are some phenomena where two-dimensional effects can be realistic? I was thinking about the plumes in fractures in the rocks and so on.
Oh, sorry, everything I've shown you today is three-dimensional.
Okay, I was thinking that if you believe that in some cases the problem is a two-dimensional one, do we have some plumes which developed in a two-dimensional?
Yeah, so you can do experiments in two-dimensional plumes as well, and I haven't talked about them. We've done a lot of work on that. The difference is the structure of the turbulence, because you tend to get larger and larger eddies forming, and you don't get the cascade in the way the turbulence dissipates. But some of these overall controls actually are very similar in terms of the dynamics. It's just the detail is a little bit different, because you tend to get very large coherent eddies that aren't, because these are three-dimensional. There's a sort of bigger distribution of eddy sizes, whereas in the 2D structures you get very, very large eddies that can actually cause other oscillations in the flow pattern. So, for example, if you do this experiment on fountains I've just shown, but in 2 dimensions, you actually get an oscillation in the whole fountain, back and forth. And because it tends to sediment on one side, and if it sediments on one side, the fluid then separates on the other side, and it generates a stable state. And after some time, that may go unstable and then flip to the other side. And so you tend to get oscillations on a longer time scale. So there's other phenomena that occur that are particular to 2D experiments. But I think some of the other phenomena I showed, most of these phenomena will carry through, but the detail may be a little bit different.
Okay, and another question, I assume that you use uniform particles, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, so the reason we've done these particle experiments is because when we started off using bubble experiments, but of course with bubbles you get a size distribution, so you get a range of rise speeds, and you also get merger and breakup of bubbles, and so the population's changing. And so in order to simplify the problem, we just have a monodispersed particle size to start with, because that means we can understand the relationship between one fall speed and these convective flows. But of course you can then build it up again. So if you rerun these experiments with multiple size particles, so for example this slide is showing 2 particle sizes, and what you see is the small particles fall out and the big ones carry on rising the big ones fall out and the small ones carry on rising in the fountain. So you can get some very different effects if you have a range of particle sizes. I think there's a lot more richness to this. Okay. In some sense, you can think of the small particles like the salt and fresh water, and the big particles as the particles I've talked about.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, may you give some insight about the scale of the experiment? And there you are.
Oh, sorry. So all these experiments are they're small. They're probably less than a meter, meter by meter tanks. And they're all scaled so that they're, we need to get to Reynolds numbers of 5,000. So we're in the turbulent regime, but that's the scale. So they're tens of centimeters to meters. The main challenge is to make them sufficiently high Reynolds number, so you're getting representative, highly turbulent flows. If you go to smaller scales than that, they tend to become more laminar, and you move into a different flow regime.
Thanks.
Any other question for Professor Woods? Yeah.
Just another question about the conditions of multiple sizes. Does the superimposition of effects apply? I would say the results from the combination of 2 particles is just the sum of what you would get from an experiment with one size and another experiment with the other size, or is that different?
So it can be quite different. So, like in this experiment here, for example, this is a fountain with 2 particle sizes, and the large particles rain out, and the small ones then carry on rising. So the large particles are behaving as if they were the particles, and the small ones are behaving as if they were the fresh water. Okay, so it's actually a very different effect there. If you go back to what I talked about at the beginning with the plume sinking down and the 5/8, okay, then if you have two particle sizes, what tends to happen is those intrusion, or the cylinder with those ripples don't develop as neatly because there's now two length scales for the ripples, and they obviously interact, and it's highly nonlinear, so they don't really develop in a very clean way. So some of the phenomena are particular to having one fall speed or a dominant fall speed. But there's many examples. So in the bubble plumes, you may get the small particles actually being carried in the convective flow, and superposed on that, you get a very high-speed channel of big bubbles in the center that aren't really part of the convective flow. And there's been quite a bit of work people have done on bubble plumes where you have a range of bubble sizes. And I think what these experiments begin to show is that the turbulent convective flow is all associated with the bubbles that are smaller than the convective rise speed. And the ones that have a higher speed aren't contributing as much to the dynamics of the plume because they tend to run up in a very simple channel up in the center. And so we've been doing experiments gradually changing particle size to demonstrate that. So I think, adding different particle sizes in the same flow can add some complexity, and it can cause the small, the big particles may be carried further because of the presence of the smaller particles when they wouldn't otherwise. Yep.
Okay, I have a curiosity about the digging of oceanic floor. Does the chemical properties of the sediment have some effects, such, for example, flocculation? Or
So a lot of the sediments flocculate, and so we're actually running experiments at the moment looking at how they flocculate. And one question is whether you break up the flocks through the mining process, and then they re-flocculate as they flow. And I think the flocculation time is comparable to the time of the flow. And so there's a very interesting problem there where you're changing the grain size distribution or the fall speed distribution as the material flows away from the tractor. And that is obviously going to reduce the distance some of the particles travel. So that's a very good point. And I think a lot of marine sediment or clay sediment deposition is strongly influenced by these flocculation processes. And of course, if you mix, in that case, it's all the deep sea water, but with shallower runoff, river runoff and so on, as you mix with the saline water, that actually changes the ionic balance and can actually start triggering flocculation. So I think there's some very interesting problems there. And that's something we're just beginning to look at.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a curiosity, the very interesting effect that you have shown in a stratified fluid is just the same used in a solar pond to storage energy. So do you think that it's possible to find out best value of the stratification just to prevent the convective heat flux within a fixed range of temperature?
So I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Because in the solar pond, the temperature is continuous change. So do you think that with this theory is possible to find out a best, I would say, ratio of stratification just to prevent the convective heat flux?
So this is where you've got particles as well, or this is just simply solar pond, a convecting pond? You can clearly design, if it's single phase convection, I guess you can try and design the depth so you don't go above the critical Rayleigh number. But if you're producing particles, they're going to, I don't know, so you're generating a crust of salt on the top of the pond? This is drying out salt in salt ponds, is it? So I guess if you then have a flux of those salt particles through the pond, that's going to generate some convective flow. But I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're talking about.
But I'm speaking about the solar pond. That it's a very common use technology just to storage energy.
Yeah.
But the temperature is of course different according to different climate condition and many other different local situation. So according to this very interesting theory, do you think it could be possible to find out a ratio between the fresh water and salt water stratification just to storage the maximum amount of energy with a solar panel?
I see.
So the question is very simple.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, you could make a two-layer system with the lower layer sufficiently dense that it's, even as it heats up, it'll remain denser than the upper layer. But you won't. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, you could do that. You'll still get convective exchange in the upper layer, but you may be able to suppress the mixing all the way to the surface. So I guess the question is how. It depends if they're miscible or immiscible. If they're miscible, I think you're going to tend to get entrainment at the interface and erode the interface. And but if you could continuously add salt or something to the lower layer to keep it dense, that would tend to suppress that convection. And then you'll get double diffusive effects. So you might start getting double diffusive layers forming. I'm not sure how it doesn't exactly carry on, or I'm not sure these results exactly imply how to optimize the use of a solar pond in that context. But I'm happy to chat later if you want.
That's enough. No, but it was just a curiosity, just to know if you have never tried to do that, and if you have never considered this opportunity using this kind of theory and this kind of knowledge, because much of the experiment that you have shown are new, I guess, for many people. So.
Yeah, I mean, I've not considered it in detail, but I mean, it is an important and interesting question. So perhaps I'll consider it. Yeah.
Just your opinion. Are you optimistic about the environmental impact of sea mining?
So I think we need to understand how the sediment that you resuspend on the seabed is transported, and I think there's a range. I think this issue about the flocculation is very important, because I think there's a range of timescales, and once you've disturbed that sediment, it may deposit quite rapidly from a buoyancy-driven, gravity-driven flow, but then it may not fully. It may be much easier to resuspend that, and as you get deep sea storms and other disturbances coming through, it may be resuspended and transported further. And so I think there's important questions about how long you need to monitor and assess the environment in the deep sea to actually understand the impact. And so I think there are experiments going on at the moment to try and understand that. But until we understand just how far that sediment may be transported, there are potential impacts because we don't fully understand the marine life down there, or the biologists don't. I'm not a biologist, but there's a lot of marine life there that isn't fully understood. But the background sedimentation rate is very slow, and if you start increasing it substantially, that'll really perturb the marine life. And I think the problem about actually where do you put the particles that are on a ship, I think some of this work shows very clearly that if you're going to put it back into the water, you need to have a pipe going right back to the seafloor. And you need to be very careful how you put it back at the seafloor, because if you put it anywhere else in the water column, you'll essentially disperse it through the water column with the currents. And it depends on the scale of how that industry grows. That could start having an impact. So I think we need to understand these questions and understand the processes before we can come to a definitive perspective. But I think there's a lot of interesting work to do, and this is really just the beginning of it. But I think this needs to be done before we go big scale into deep sea mining.
Thank you.
Okay. I have a technical question about the first part of your talk. You showed plumes propagating into linearly stratified density of water or fluid.
Yeah.
What would be, in your opinion, the influence of other shapes of this stratification, say a nonlinear one, like in the atmosphere? Typically, the density profile is nonlinear.
That's very interesting. So we've actually done a series of experiments in non-uniform. So if you look at the water column profile here, it isn't linear. It's actually, and so what tends to happen is, so sometimes you can model this as a step change, a two-layer system, but this is actually really quite stratified. And so that'll tend to arrest the flow. And what's very interesting is that you can get the flow intruding here and spreading out, and the particles then start settling. If the layer below is well mixed, you actually regenerate a plume, because the only reason we get a cylinder forming below is because of the stratification that stops the flow accelerating, because it suppresses any convection. If you make the layer well mixed, you can actually start generating a convective flow in that particle-laden zone that'll accelerate to some, and if it's fully unstratified, it'll keep on accelerating, mixing, and then it'll eventually sort of map onto a new cylinder. But if you have a weak stratification down here, you can get a second intrusion. And so you can get two intrusions, one at the thermocline and then one deeper down in the very weakly stratified deep ocean. So that's one effect of it, but I think there's the other effect is that the entrainment itself, if the stratification changes fast enough, the entrainment itself may change. So once the plume radius becomes comparable to the length scale of the stratification, which again occurs at the interface, we can't really model it as a plume. We have to actually model that transition. So there are two areas where you need to be careful. But I think otherwise, these models, at least at leading order, give you a flavor of how the system evolves. I mean, the atmosphere is very interesting because, of course, the atmosphere gets more stratified as you go up, but volcanic plumes do show secondary intrusions as well, which I think are associated with this particle separation.
Thank you. I was just wondering, is it the goal to get the nozzles to a point where you can collect them directly, or because in your explanation, you mentioned that the nozzles get to a certain height. You seem to be quite interested in the height they get. And then the particles are the nozzles you mentioned. Yes.
Which nozzles?
The particles, you call them nozzles, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So is it your goal to get them to a certain height and then collect them, or what's the interest in those, the height of the particles, the nozzles?
So I guess what these people doing mining want to recover the nodules and take them off and process them as a processing plant on shore, and they're collecting them on the ship because it's in the marine environment. Okay. What we're interested in is understanding where the sediment and the other material that they're not actually keeping actually goes. If they could collect all that as well and keep that on the ship and go to the shore, but that would be a huge extra load that would change that would be less efficient in terms of the mining process. And so the idea is you put that back in the ocean. And so we're trying to understand how can you put it back in the ocean without actually suspending it throughout the ocean, because that will have a major impact on the ocean, which we don't want. So we're trying to understand what are those processes. So what we're interested in is where the particles go once they're in these plumes or in these suspension currents. Okay.
So the main system of collection is through this, like what we have in the figure. You have something like
these are concepts really. I mean, there's some pilot tests going on at the moment, but these are really concepts. So they have tractors that run along the seabed, collect the nodules, and then they're taken up a riser.
Yeah, because I know there's the activities also like dredging where they collect the sediment.
There's a series of different technologies, but I guess the consequence of most of the processes is that you will resuspend quite a lot of sediment.
Okay, thank you.
Just one last question if you have.
I would like to go back to an example that you have shown of air injection at the bottom of this simplified tank. You mentioned about an example related to Lake Ginebra, if I'm not in error. So I'm wondering, in some cases, the injection is of pure oxygen at the bottom of a lake, in a situation in which the water is actually totally desaturated of oxygen. In that case, the oxygen, I suppose, could get dissolved inside the water. So I'm wondering, how do you believe that this could affect the plume features? Do you expect the same type of phenomena? And then a second observation regarding Professor Tanda's question. I'm afraid that when you consider deep sea mining, the problem is the resuspension of reduced substances contained inside the sediments. And these are in ionic states. So I believe that for sure the effect from the environmental point of view is very heavy and only partly explainable in terms of sediment suspensions and redeposition. Could you comment on this? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's two great questions. So, yeah, your first question about having a soluble gas is really interesting because obviously that's another process going on in the plumes, and these experiments don't account for that. But if you have oxygen being soluble, what can happen is the bubble size distribution will decrease with time, and eventually you'll resorb or absorbs a lot of that oxygen, and it'll no longer be driving a plume. So what happens is the dynamics can change from having a bubble plume, a buoyancy-driven plume with the bubbles producing the buoyancy. That will generate a momentum flux of water plus bubbles. As those bubbles resorb, what can then happen is the momentum flux of that flow basically turns it into a fountain, especially if it's in a stratified system, because that water's come from deep in the system. And so then it's become a negatively buoyant fountain, and that'll carry on rising some distance, perhaps carry on resorbing the bubbles, but it'll rise to a distance controlled by the fountain dynamics then. So you can get a transition from a positively buoyant to a negatively buoyant flow. It'll overshoot, and then once it's stopped, it'll then sink back again, back to some neutral height. And so the height it arrives at and spreads out will be very different from the case where you don't include the resorption. And that's a really interesting question with huge implications both for what you're saying, but also for some of the CCS type problems going on at the moment. So we're doing a lot of work on that, but I haven't got it to present today. The other question about the deep sea mining, I absolutely agree. Quite a lot of material may dissolve into the water if you resuspend it, and that's why it's so important to understand the fate of the water. And so it's not just the particles. So the particles are sort of host to this soluble material, but when you resuspend it, you then want to understand where the water goes. And so I think understanding when is the water dynamics controlled by the particles and this large-scale particle-driven convection, and when is it actually separate? And so I think, for example, things like these plume experiments showing this 5/8 height is where the water ends up in the water column, that isn't actually any of the sediment, but that may be where there's quite a big environmental impact. And so I think we're trying to understand both the water and the sediment. So no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think there's a lot we need to understand, and there's two types of impact. One is redissolving this material in the water, and then how quickly does that remain in one part of the deep ocean, or does it then get mixed up, and what's the timescale for that? And then the other question is where the sediment goes. I think the interest in the sediment, I mean, that's where we've been starting, just in terms of does it change the background sedimentation rates significantly, because I think some of the marine life down there is used to having a very, very slow sedimentation rate. But obviously, you don't want to resuspend all that soluble material and dissolve it through the whole ocean. So that's a really important point. And I think all these questions need to be understood, which is why there's a lot of good science to do here.
Okay, we thank Professor Woods for the interesting talk.